Have you ever walked into a room and felt like you weren't just being seen, you were being measured? That's how Lorraine felt the moment she stepped into that private dining room. Crystal chandeliers, white linen tables, the kind of place where the menu doesn't list prices because if you have to ask, you can't afford it. And yet there she was, invited, or so she thought. Lorraine Jackson had spent 27 years as a wife, 27 years building a man, standing beside him when he had more ambition than income. She ironed his shirts when they only had two. She packed his lunches when the checking account was running on prayers. And now? Now she was the ex-wife. And tonight, she was the punchline. You see, the invitation came from her former sister-in-law, Denise, a family reconciliation dinner, she'd called it. Said it was time to move forward, said they were all too grown for bitterness. Lorraine should have known better, because when she walked in, every head turned, not in welcome, but in curiosity, the kind that says, "Oh, she really came." Denise stood up first, hugged her tight, too tight. "Lorraine, honey," she smiled sweetly, "we're so proud of Marcus. You've seen the news, right?" Lorraine nodded. Of course she had. Marcus Jackson, her ex-husband, had become a household name in tech investment. After the divorce, his startup skyrocketed. Private equity deals, venture capital, interviews on business channels. The headlines called him a visionary, but Lorraine remembered the man who couldn't balance a checkbook without a calculator. Funny how history edits itself when money shows up. She took her seat. Then came the comments, subtle at first. "Well, Lorraine, it must be interesting seeing Marcus thrive like this. Some women just don't recognize greatness when they're married to it." And then the laughter, soft, controlled, surgical. Lorraine smiled politely because women of her generation, they don't explode in public. They endure. But inside, she was remembering the nights she worked double shifts while Marcus brainstormed, the time she paid the mortgage so he could network. She almost laughed herself, because the same people praising him now once whispered that she should leave him before he dragged her down. Isn't that something? Let me ask you something. Have you ever sacrificed for someone who later acted like you were never part of the journey? I see you nodding. Lorraine felt that nod in her bones. Then Denise cleared her throat and raised her wine glass. "To Marcus," she announced, "the man who proved that sometimes you have to lose dead weight to rise." The table erupted in agreement. Dead weight. Lorraine blinked once. Just once. And that's when the restaurant doors opened. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for a hush to ripple across the room. Because the man who walked in wasn't just wealthy, he was legendary. And when his eyes scanned the room, they landed directly on Lorraine. And he smiled. "Now let me tell you something about power. Real power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't stomp, it doesn't shout. It walks in calm and lets everybody else adjust." That's exactly what happened when Charles Whitmore stepped into that dining room. Yes, that Charles Whitmore, the trillionaire investor, the man business magazines called the quiet architect, the one who bought companies the way most folks buy coffee. And he wasn't supposed to be there. Conversations froze mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Even Denise's smile stiffened like overcooked macaroni. Lorraine hadn't seen Charles in over a year, not since the charity board luncheon where she volunteered quietly in the background, arranging centerpieces and making sure donors had sparkling water. He'd noticed her then. Not because she tried to be noticed, but because she wasn't trying at all. Now here he was, tailored charcoal suit, silver at his temples, posture straight as Sunday morning. He didn't look at anyone else. He walked directly toward Lorraine, and every step sounded louder than it should have. Click, click, click. You could almost hear the air asking questions. When he reached her table, he didn't ask permission. He didn't hesitate. He pulled out the chair beside her and sat down. "Lorraine," he said gently, like they were the only two people in the room, "I hope I'm not late." "Late?" Denise blinked. "Excuse me? I'm not sure." Charles turned slowly, polite smile, sharp eyes. "Oh, I was invited," he said smoothly. "Lorraine and I had plans this evening." Now hold on. Let's pause right here, because you know when something doesn't add up, when you're watching a situation and thinking, wait, what did I miss? That's what the whole table was thinking. Lorraine herself looked stunned. Plans? They hadn't spoken since that luncheon beyond polite emails. But Charles reached for her hand, steady, warm, intentional. "You look beautiful tonight," he added. And Lorraine, who had been shrinking herself all evening, felt something unfamiliar. Seen. Not pitied, not compared. Seen. Denise forced a laugh. "Well, this is intensive." "Yes," Charles replied calmly. "I find dignity often shows up where it's least appreciated." Now you could have heard a spoon drop. Marcus's name had been floating around that table all night like a trophy, but suddenly the spotlight shifted. And here's where it gets interesting, because just as the waiter approached, suddenly extra attentive, Charles did something no one anticipated. He signaled for the manager. Not loudly, not arrogantly, just a small gesture. And within seconds, the general manager of the entire restaurant rushed over personally, smiling, nervous. "Mr. Whitmore," he said respectfully, "we didn't realize you'd be joining us this evening." Joining us? Denise's wine glass trembled slightly, because something had just become painfully clear. This wasn't Lorraine's humiliation dinner anymore. This was something else entirely. And when the manager asked Charles whether he'd like the usual private arrangement, Charles glanced at Lorraine, not the table. "Well," he said softly, "that depends on my wife." Wife. The word hung in the air like thunder before rain. Lorraine's heart skipped. The room stopped breathing, and Marcus, who had just walked in behind Charles unnoticed, heard every single syllable. "Now listen. There are words that whisper, and then there are words that detonate. Wife." Charles didn't raise his voice, didn't repeat himself, but that one word landed heavier than all the crystal in that chandelier. Lorraine felt it first in her spine. Wife? Her mind scrambled. She hadn't remarried, hadn't even dated seriously. After Marcus, she told herself she was done building men who planned to outgrow her. So what was Charles doing? But here's the thing about seasoned women, and I know my audience understands this. Sometimes you don't react right away. You assess. Lorraine turned her head slowly toward him. His expression was calm, steady, not playful, not joking, intentional. Across the table, Denise let out a strained chuckle. "Oh, you two are funny. Lorraine, you didn't tell us you were seeing someone." Seeing someone. Like Lorraine was 16. Charles didn't look at Denise. He was still looking at Lorraine. "I asked her a question," he said gently. "Would you prefer the private suite, or are you comfortable here?" Now that's what we call a pattern interrupt, because just 5 minutes ago, Lorraine was the dead weight. And now, the most powerful man in the room was asking her preference. Let me ask you something. When was the last time someone asked what you preferred without agenda? Mm-hmm. That silence you just felt? Lorraine felt it too. Marcus finally stepped forward. And oh, he looked good. Tailored navy suit, polished shoes, the kind of confidence money buys quickly when it comes all at once. Charles Whitmore, Marcus said smoothly, extending his hand. Didn't expect to see you here. Ah, so they knew each other. Charles stood slowly, took Marcus's hand, firm grip, one measured nod. Marcus. Just that. No praise, no excitement, no hierarchy shift. Equal ground. And that unsettled Marcus more than anything. Because here's what most people don't understand about new money. It wants acknowledgement. Old power? It doesn't need applause. Denise jumped in quickly. Marcus was just telling us about his expansion into international markets. Oh, Charles said calmly. Which sectors? Marcus launched into a polished explanation. Tech infrastructure, global partnerships, aggressive acquisitions. Impressive. Very impressive. Until Charles asked one small question. And who structured your initial capital bridge? Marcus paused. Just slightly. You know, the one that prevented dilution during your second funding round? Lorraine blinked. She remembered that round. That was the one that almost collapsed. The one that caused 3 months of tension so thick she could barely breathe in her own home. Marcus cleared his throat. That was handled through private channels. Charles smiled faintly. Yes, it was. And then, without breaking eye contact, he reached into his jacket and placed a thin leather folder on the table. The table, not in Marcus's hand, on the table. I believe, Charles continued calmly, you may have forgotten to mention Lorraine's contribution. Denise frowned. Contribution? She wasn't in tech. No, she wasn't. But Lorraine suddenly felt her pulse in her ears because she knew exactly what that folder might contain. And if it was what she thought, then this dinner was about to flip in a way none of them were prepared for. Not even Marcus. Now, let's slow this down. Because sometimes the truth doesn't shout, it unfolds. Charles rested his hand lightly on the leather folder. Marcus, he said evenly, would you like to explain, or shall I? That's when Lorraine knew. She didn't need to open it. She didn't need to read a single page. She knew. Because 29 years ago, back when their apartment smelled like burnt toast and unpaid bills, she had done something Marcus swore no one needed to know. She mortgaged her inheritance. Not millions, not glamorous money, just the small home her grandmother left her in Savannah. A house built by hands that had survived segregation, redlining, and every closed door America ever tried to slam. Lorraine sold it quietly, signed papers with shaking hands, deposited the funds into Marcus's temporary emergency account. Temporary. He called it a short-term bridge. She called it belief. And he promised her one thing. No matter what happens, I'll make sure you're protected. Now, let me ask you something. How many promises have you heard that sounded solid at the time? Marcus shifted his weight. Denise looked confused. What inheritance? She asked sharply. Lorraine kept her posture straight. She wasn't shaking anymore. Charles opened the folder. Inside were photocopies, wire transfers, property deeds, signed documentation, and at the bottom, her signature, clear as day, Lorraine Bennett Jackson. The capital that saved Marcus's company in its infancy came from her, not venture capitalists, not angel investors, her. Charles spoke calmly. When Marcus's second funding round failed, Creditors were prepared to force liquidation. That property sale, he tapped the page gently, created the liquidity that allowed him to renegotiate. Marcus's jaw tightened. "You're exaggerating," he said. Charles tilted his head slightly. "I'm precise. That's the difference. New wealth gets loud. Old wealth gets documented." The table had gone silent. Even the waitstaff sensed something shifting. Denise looked at Lorraine like she was seeing her for the first time. "You never said anything," she whispered. Lorraine finally spoke. Her voice wasn't angry, it wasn't bitter, it was steady. "No one asked." Now that right there, that's a generational truth. Women like Lorraine weren't taught to list their sacrifices. They were taught to make them. Marcus tried to recover. "That was years ago. We were married. It wasn't some business transaction." Lorraine looked at him, really looked at him. "And yet," she said softly, "when you filed for divorce, your attorneys listed me as non-contributing spouse." The words sliced clean. Denise gasped. Charles closed the folder. "I find it fascinating," he said calmly, "how memory improves when wealth increases." Marcus's jaw was cracking. But here's the part nobody saw coming. Because Charles wasn't finished. Not even close. He turned to Lorraine again. "Tell them," he said gently, "what happened to the equity agreement?" Lorraine's heart skipped. Equity agreement. She hadn't thought about that in years. Because if that document still existed, then this wasn't just about recognition. This was about ownership. And Marcus knew it. Let me ask you something before we go any further. Have you ever held on to something? Not because you planned to use it, but because deep down you knew one day you might need it? Lorraine did. She didn't hold on to anger. She didn't hold on to bitterness. But she held on to paperwork. See, back when Marcus was still building his dream on a folding table in their dining room, there was one night he came home shaking, excited, terrified, breathless. "They're offering me advisory equity," he told her. She didn't even know what that meant at the time, but she listened, because that's what she always did. He explained how a small investor group wanted in, but they needed a capital buffer first. That's when Lorraine suggested selling her grandmother's house. And Marcus, eyes wide with ambition, said something that night he probably forgot. "Then you're not just my wife, you're my partner." Partner. Not helper, not supporter. Partner. He had his attorney draft a simple equity acknowledgement. Informal, he said. Temporary, he said. 5% ownership stake tied to her capital injection. 5%. At the time, it sounded symbolic. Today, let's just say 5% of a $1 trillion empire doesn't fit in a small envelope. Now, back to that dining room. Charles's eyes remained on Lorraine. "What happened to the agreement?" he repeated gently. Charles laughed too quickly. "That document was voided during restructuring. It was symbolic. We were married." Symbolic. Lorraine tilted her head slightly. "You asked me to keep it safe," she said calmly. Marcus froze. The room felt smaller. "You said investors might get nervous if they knew your wife had equity." Denise blinked. "Wait, you hid this?" Marcus shot her a look. But Lorraine wasn't finished. "You also said," she continued softly, "that if anything ever happened between us, you would honor it privately." The air turned thick. Charles folded his hands on the table. "And did you?" he asked Marcus. Marcus didn't answer. Because the truth? He assumed Lorraine had thrown it away, assumed she was too heartbroken to think strategically, assumed she didn't understand its value. There's that word again. Assumed. Let me ask you something. Why is it that some people mistake kindness for ignorance? Lorraine reached into her purse. Not dramatically, not hurried. Slowly, deliberately. And she pulled out a slim, weathered envelope, edges softened by time. She placed it on the table beside Charles's folder. I never needed it. Until tonight. Marcus's face drained of color, because he recognized that envelope. He remembered the night he handed it to her. He remembered saying, "Just tuck this away somewhere." He never imagined that somewhere would become his reckoning. Charles didn't touch the envelope. He didn't need to. Everyone at the table understood. If that equity agreement was still legally enforceable, even partially, then Lorraine wasn't dead weight. She was foundational capital. And the humiliation dinner had just become a financial earthquake. But here's the twist. Lorraine didn't open the envelope. Instead, she leaned back in her chair. Calm, composed, powerful in a way that had nothing to do with money. And she said something that no one, not even Charles, expected. I don't want the 5%. Now that changed everything. Now hold on, because I know what some of you just did. You sat up a little straighter. 5% of a $1 trillion valuation, and she said she didn't want it? Let's breathe, because Lorraine wasn't foolish, she wasn't naive, and she definitely wasn't emotional. She was strategic. The room had gone so quiet, you could hear the faint hum of the air vents. Marcus stared at her like she'd lost her mind. You don't want it? He repeated. Lorraine shook her head gently. No. Denise blinked rapidly, clearly calculating numbers in her head. But that's... She stopped herself. Life-changing money, generational wealth, security, revenge, validation, all wrapped in 5%. Charles finally leaned forward slightly. Lorraine, he said carefully, you are entitled to it. Entitled. Interesting word. She looked at him warmly. I know. And that's when she turned back to Marcus. But I don't want something you'll claim I took from you, she said calmly. I want something you can't deny was always mine. Now let that sit, because this wasn't about cash. It was about acknowledgement, recognition, truth. Marcus swallowed. What exactly are you asking for? Lorraine folded her hands on the table, the same table where she'd been called dead weight less than 30 minutes ago. I want a public correction. Denise scoffed softly. A correction? Yes, Lorraine replied evenly. You've done interviews, podcasts, keynotes. You tell the story of your solo grind, the garage startup, the self-made journey. She paused. I want the full story told. Now let me ask you something. Why is it easier for some men to share credit with strangers than with the woman who stood beside them? Marcus shifted uncomfortably. That's branding, he muttered. Investors respond to founders with singular vision. Charles chuckled softly. Investors respond to integrity, he corrected. Lorraine continued. I don't need your money. I built my own life after the divorce, quietly, respectfully, but I won't sit at a table and be described as excess weight. The strength in her voice wasn't loud. It was settled, earned. Marcus tried one last angle. And if I refuse? Charles finally looked at him directly. Then the agreement becomes relevant. No threat, just fact. Denise's eyes widened. Because here's the reality. 5% wasn't just money. It was influence, board voting power, shareholder leverage, and if Lorraine chose to exercise it, Marcus's empire wouldn't collapse, but it would shift publicly. Lorraine leaned forward slightly. "I don't want your downfall," she said softly. "I want my name restored." And that's when something unexpected happened. Marcus looked at her, not defensively, not arrogantly, but honestly, for the first time that evening. Because deep down, he knew she was right. But what he said next, nobody saw coming. Marcus exhaled slowly. And when a man like that exhales slowly, it means something inside him is cracking. "You think I don't know what you did for me?" he said quietly. Now that caught everyone off guard, because arrogance is loud, but guilt? Guilt lowers its voice. Lorraine didn't interrupt. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She just watched him. And sometimes that's more powerful than speaking. Marcus ran a hand over his jaw. "I never meant to erase you," he continued. "It just happened." Lorraine tilted her head slightly. "Erasure doesn't happen," she replied softly. "It's done." Oof. Let that sit for a second. Have you ever had someone say, "That wasn't my intention," as if intention erases impact? Marcus looked down at the table. "You left," he said. There was the pivot, the rewrite. Lorraine blinked once. "I left after your attorneys served me papers listing me as non-contributing," she reminded him calmly. Denise shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Charles remained silent but attentive. Marcus sighed. "You were always steady," he said, almost to himself. "You didn't push for spotlight. You didn't network. You didn't chase." Lorraine gave the smallest smile. "I was working," she said. "2 jobs." Pattern interrupt. Let's just acknowledge something real quick. How many women built dreams quietly while someone else stood on the stage? Marcus continued, voice lower now. "When the investors started coming around, they told me to simplify the narrative. They said complexity weakens brand identity." Lorraine almost laughed. "So I became complexity?" "You became history," he admitted. There it is. And sometimes the truth doesn't sound cruel, it sounds practical, but practical can still wound. Marcus looked up at her again. "I convinced myself it didn't matter, that you'd moved on, that bringing it up would only reopen old wounds." Lorraine nodded slowly. "And did it make you feel bigger?" she asked gently, "telling the story without me?" That question didn't attack, it exposed. Marcus didn't answer immediately, because here's what he was realizing in real time. He didn't erase Lorraine because she was insignificant. He erased her because she was foundational, and foundational credit complicates the myth of the self-made man. Charles finally spoke. "Integrity isn't convenient, it's consistent." Denise looked between them, clearly uncomfortable with how the dinner had shifted from mockery to moral audit. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "If I correct the record publicly," he said carefully, "it changes perceptions." Lorraine nodded. "Yes." "And if I don't?" Charles answered this time. "Then the agreement becomes enforceable." No drama, just options. The table sat in silence again, but this silence felt different, heavier, decisive. And then Marcus asked the one question that revealed everything. "Why now?" Lorraine met his gaze steadily. "Because tonight," she said softly, "you allowed them to call me dead weight." And that landed harder than any document ever could. Marcus looked around the table. At Denise, at the guests, at the wine glasses still half full, and for the first time that evening he seemed unsure of his own power. But what Lorraine did next? That's what truly shifted the room. Now, this is the part I want you to lean into. Because Lorraine didn't cry. She didn't yell. She didn't storm out dramatically like a scene from a daytime soap. No, she did something far more unsettling. She stood up, slowly, gracefully. And when she did, every chair at that table seemed smaller. "I'm not here to destroy you," she said, her voice calm but steady enough to hold the room. "I'm here because I finally understand something." Marcus looked up at her. Denise stopped pretending to sip her wine. Charles watched, not intervening, just present. Lorraine smoothed her dress, the same navy wrap dress she almost didn't wear tonight because she didn't want to look like she was trying. Funny how women downplay themselves in rooms that already decided who they are. "I spent years thinking silence was strength," she continued. "I thought if I didn't correct the record, time would." She paused. "But time doesn't correct narratives. People do. Now let me ask you something. How many times have you swallowed your truth because you didn't want to look bitter?" "Mm-hmm." Lorraine felt that same swallow for years. She turned to Denise. "You called me dead weight." Denise stiffened. "It was just an expression." "No," Lorraine replied gently. "It was an assumption." Then she turned back to Marcus. "You built something extraordinary. I will never deny that. But you did not build it alone." There it is again. Not accusation. Correction. Marcus's jaw tightened. "I can issue a statement," he said slowly. "A formal acknowledgement. Credit your early support." Lorraine shook her head. "Support?" The word almost amused her. "I wasn't cheering from the sidelines. I was in the trenches." Charles nodded subtly. Lorraine took a breath. "I don't want a footnote. I want the truth told the same way you tell your struggle." Marcus studied her. "You want me to say you were co-founder?" The room stilled again. Because that word, co-founder, it changes everything. Board recognition, historical record, media narratives, legacy. Lorraine didn't answer immediately. She let the weight of it sit. "I want you to say what's accurate," she replied. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Because Marcus wasn't just weighing pride, he was weighing power. And admitting she was co-founder wouldn't just honor her, it would reframe his entire origin story. Denise leaned in nervously. "Marcus, think about your investors." Charles responded before Marcus could. "Serious investors respect transparency. Manufactured mythology collapses under scrutiny." Marcus looked between them, between the man who now held more wealth than he could fathom, and the woman who once held him steady when he had nothing. And then he said something that revealed his real fear. "If I change the narrative," he said quietly, "people will ask why I didn't say sooner." Lorraine's expression softened. "Yes," she said gently, "they will." And that's when she delivered the line that shifted the power completely. "But that won't embarrass me." Silence. Because the only person exposed in that scenario would be him. And suddenly, this dinner wasn't about humiliation anymore. It was about accountability. But what Charles said next, that changed the stakes entirely. Now, at this point, you'd think the night had already flipped upside down. But oh no, it was just warming up. Charles adjusted his cufflinks, slow, deliberate, the kind of movement that says, "I'm about to change the direction of this room." "Charles," he said calmly, "there is another option." Denise looked like she might faint. "Another option?" Marcus narrowed his eyes slightly. "What option?" Charles folded his hands. You're preparing for your global expansion round next quarter. Marcus's posture stiffened. That information wasn't public yet. I've reviewed your projections, Charles continued evenly. Impressive. Aggressive. Risk-heavy. Lorraine glanced at him, surprised. Reviewed? Marcus swallowed. And? And, Charles said softly, my firm was considering participating. The table froze, because when Charles Whitmore's firm participates, markets shift. Stock prices climb. Confidence multiplies. Denise's face lit up instinctively. That would be incredible. Marcus remained cautious. Was? Charles nodded slightly. Yes, was. And there it is. You could feel the temperature drop 3 degrees. Why was? Marcus asked carefully. Charles leaned back in his chair. Because I invest in leadership, he said, and leadership includes how a person handles legacy. Legacy. Not profit, not growth. Legacy. Lorraine remained still. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't orchestrated it. But she wasn't shrinking from it either. Charles continued, if Lorraine's role is publicly acknowledged accurately, as it should be, my firm will not only participate in your expansion, will lead it. Denise gasped softly. Lead it? That meant billions, influence, security. Marcus stared at Charles. And if I don't? Charles's voice didn't change. Then we withdraw interest entirely. Now let's pause, because this isn't revenge. This is alignment. Charles wasn't punishing Marcus. He was setting a standard. Marcus ran both hands over his face slowly. You're leveraging my company to settle a personal issue. Charles shook his head. No, he replied calmly. I'm evaluating your character. Oof, that lands differently, doesn't it? Lorraine felt something unexpected rising in her chest. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Clarity. For years, she thought her silence was noble. Tonight, she realized silence protects the wrong people. Marcus looked at her again, and for the first time since walking into that restaurant, there was no performance in his eyes, just calculation, and something else. Regret. He turned back to Charles. If I correct the record publicly, he said slowly, and acknowledge Lorraine as co-founder, you'll lead the expansion? Yes, Charles replied simply. Marcus looked down at the leather folder, at the envelope Lorraine brought, at the woman he once called partner. And then he said something no one expected. Give me the microphone. The room shifted again, because that meant one thing. This wasn't going to stay inside this private dining room, and when Marcus stood up, Lorraine had no idea what version of him was about to speak. Now let me paint this picture for you. Private dining room, 40 guests, crystal glasses, low jazz humming in the background, and suddenly, a microphone. Because Denise, trying to save face earlier in the evening, had arranged for a small celebratory toast setup, a portable mic near the podium at the front of the room. That mic was supposed to amplify praise, not confession. Marcus walked toward it slowly. Every step sounded louder than the last. Lorraine remained standing beside her chair. Charles stayed seated, composed, observant. Denise whispered to someone near her, "This isn't necessary." But it was. Marcus picked up the microphone, tapped it once. The feedback squeaked slightly. Pattern interrupt. Have you ever noticed how uncomfortable truth feels right before it's spoken? Marcus cleared his throat. I planned to give a very different speech tonight, he began. A few nervous chuckles floated across the room. He didn't smile. I was going to talk about growth, vision, expansion. He paused. But something important has been missing from every version of my story. Lorraine felt her pulse in her fingertips. Because here's the thing about public correction. Once it's said, it can't be unsaid. Marcus looked directly at her. Lorraine Jackson, he said into the microphone, voice steady but stripped of polish, was not a bystander in my company's early days. The room stilled. She was the capital bridge that prevented its collapse. A murmur rippled through the guests. Denise's face went pale. Marcus continued. When our second funding round failed, it was Lorraine who liquidated her inheritance to provide emergency liquidity. There it is, out loud, no footnote, no euphemism. He swallowed. She held an equity agreement reflecting that contribution, 5%. Gasps, actual gasps. And let me ask you something. Why is it shocking when a woman owns part of the story? Marcus's voice softened slightly. I did not publicly acknowledge that partnership after our divorce. Silence. You could feel the weight of accountability settling into the carpet. That omission, he continued, was mine. No blaming branding, no blaming investors, no deflecting. Mine. Lorraine felt something release in her chest she didn't even realize she'd been holding for years. Not anger, not resentment, tension. Marcus inhaled slowly. Lorraine was my partner, he said clearly, in life and in business, and history should reflect that. And just like that, the narrative shifted, not just in that room, but in every future interview, every article, every keynote. Co-founder. The word wasn't flashy, but it was permanent. Marcus lowered the microphone. For a split second, no one moved. Then Charles began to clap, slowly, intentionally, one measured clap at a time. And then the rest of the room followed. But Lorraine wasn't watching the guests. She was watching Marcus, because what he said next, off mic, just for her, mattered even more. He stepped down from the podium, walked back toward her, and quietly said, I'm sorry I made you smaller so I could feel bigger. Now tell me, how many apologies come decades too late? Lorraine studied his face, and what she did next was the final shift of the night. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. If this story touched your heart, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories about resilience, dignity, and quiet justice. Because some lessons don't come with applause. They come with peace.